Thanks, Andy. Well, some bad news and some good news. So the bad news is that I'm standing in the way between you and a cold drink. The good news is that I saw that the door to the roof terrace is open. So hopefully you'll get to enjoy some sunshine a little bit later as well. But this is one of the key questions at the moment. What is wealth? And the basis of this conversation today, this presentation really, is a talk that I give at the University of Cambridge to postgrad students who are studying this kind of thing, sustainable business. I sit on the Asset Allocation Committee, the Equity Selection Committee here at Rathbones, so can tell you that it's something that we do talk about. But let's dive straight in, because I know that you're going to have some good questions later, so I want to get through the content as quickly as we can. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll do an exploration of what wealth is. This audience doesn't need me to tell you, that wealth is much more than money. There's much more to it than that. We'll explore the 5 capitals context. We'll look at the context for investors today as well, because that's complicated. And we've heard this afternoon just how difficult the environment is for investors. There's a lot on investors' plates at the moment. We'll indulge in a little bit of systems thinking, talk a bit about funding gaps, a little bit about the mindset shift that might be required, and then we'll hopefully come to a conclusion. But I will warn you that I think we'll all leave today with more questions than answers, but I think it's going to be thought-provoking nonetheless. I hope it is. Let's jump in. So where do we start when we try and answer this question? Well, Google's a good first step. We could use ChatGPT actually, and that is something that I've been starting to use, but didn't have time to put this into this pack. So let's use this first definition from Google. And there's no surprise when we ask it about what the definition of wealth is, that it's talking about riches, treasure, money, the money in our pocket. That is the first answer that lots of people come to. Financial wealth, it could be the value of a portfolio, assets within a portfolio, whatever they might be. But when I first started to research this and study it, I wanted to go further than that. Surely we've got to go further than that. And I looked at the derivation, the etymology of the word. And it's no surprise, because it's there staring us in the face, that this word health is clearly an explicit part of the word wealth, and is part of its root, if you like. So there's a different lens through which we need to view wealth. It needs to be more than just money. We need to think about it more than just its evolutionary terms from 400 years ago when we thought about wealth, or our predecessors did, as land, as cattle, as agriculture, through to the Industrial Revolution when it became commodities, it became machinery, and even to today when it's digital currencies. Software is a form of digital wealth. Let's look at it through a slightly different lens, which you may have seen before. This is what's called the 5 capitals model. This is supposed to be a pyramid, but when the marketing team republished very skillfully my presentation pack, it became slightly kind of disjointed. But hopefully you can see that we've got 5 different forms of capital here: financial and manufactured capital. Financial capital is what we often think about wealth as being. Manufactured capital is what we do with that money, the buildings, the bridges, etc., that we build as part of our society. And I would say that this top of the pyramid is what this square mile thinks almost myopically about. I've worked here for 25 years. I can tell you that it's only just recently that we've started to think much more about the other parts of this pyramid: human capital, social capital, and of course, natural capital. And you may wonder why I'm using this word capital to describe these things. And it's because capital as a stock has flows, and we can start to talk about some of the flows that come from these forms of capital. Trust being one of the key parts of, or outputs of, social capital, for example. Our society only functions because there is an element of trust. Trust between counterparties, trust between us in this room, trust between us and government, trust between institutions, for example. And we're going to talk today a bit about how this is breaking down, not just in social capital, but natural capital. We know that it's important to have higher levels of trust and healthy social capital, because those economies, it's been studied, those economies that have high degrees of interpersonal trust achieve a higher rate of GDP growth. And then we come to natural capital, the part that this entire edifice rests upon. and depends upon nature. The services, the flows from this natural capital, of course, are ecosystem services, so clean water, precipitation, stable climate, clean air, these kinds of things. So let's explore this a little bit further and just talk a little bit about why these parts of the pyramid upon which financial and manufactured capital are dependent are suffering a bit at the moment. But before we do that, let's just kind of touch on inheritance as well, because there is, this is a key part of the conversation in an organisation like Rathbones with our clients, particularly for private clients, but to a degree also for charities as well. What use is actually creating this wealth if it's actually going to cascade to future generations in a world where they can't actually use it in a way that will actually make them thrive. So what's the context for investors today? Well, it's a complex scene. What we're looking at here has also been called the polycrisis. This is a schematic from the World Economic Forum, and we'll come to another graph from them in a second, which tries to take this complex picture and make it a bit more linear. But the key takeaway here is that all of these risks are interlinked, they're interdependent, and they escalate and de-escalate each other. Many of those aspects that I talked about in relation to social and natural capital, as well as financial and manufactured capital, are within this schematic here. So we'll come back to this again, but it's important just to understand that investors have a lot on their plate at the moment, whilst also trying to think about wealth in a more holistic sense. As I said, in a more linear sense, this again is from the World Economic Forum, and it shows how this year, and they do this every year, top 10 risks for the next 2 years and the next 10 years look. They try to prioritise them for us so that we can try to see which ones are the most pressing. And it's quite startling to see that the top 5, half of the top 10 risks are green, they're environmental, so they're related to that degradation of natural capital, and there are clearly, inequality, societal polarisation, elements of a fraying of social capital within these risks as well. Who's seen this before? Who may have seen this, not necessarily for this year, but for previous years? Nobody. You've seen it, of course. So let's just take climate as one example. We touched on climate over the course of this afternoon. Adam talked about it a little bit when he was talking about our projections for economic returns, and Jonathan talked about it as well when we were talking about, in relation to that question about AI and energy use. So how hot is it? Well, clearly global temperatures are rising at a pace that is faster than we're used to. This is a picture of the long term going back over the last 2,000 years or so, and you can see that climate is not something that's desperately stable, but in the last 170 years we have seen a significant pickup, and this is the picture if we zoomed in just on that period, and we can see how observed temperature change has picked up really in the last 70 years or so. We can also see what would have happened had anthropogenic climate change not occurred. In other words, what is the simulated outcome of just natural only solar and volcanic impacts on global temperatures, and that it would be a lot more stable. So what are we doing about this? Well, interestingly, and I would stress that this is ambition rather than actual policy, we now have a net zero scene, that an ambition to achieve net zero that covers nearly 80% of emissions globally, nearly 80% of GDP globally, and more than 80% of the population. But it's really important to understand that this is not actual policy. And of course, we've seen significant rowing back by the US administration twice from the same person in the space of 6 or 7 years. Trump does come up a bit later, but I haven't actually we won't mention him that much. Hopefully you'll bring him up when we come to the questions. What are tipping points? Well, this is an interesting study from some of the world's leading Earth system scientists, which shows across these various Earth systems, from the Greenland ice sheet, West Antarctic ice sheet, going through the Amazon rainforest, Arctic, East Antarctic ice sheet, etc., boreal forests. How many of the Earth systems, or at least at what temperature these Earth systems would shift from their current state, they would tip into another state which would be accelerating and irreversible. This is a stage that we really don't want to get to. And what stunned me about this study was that 6, indeed almost 7, of those Earth systems are likely to tip within the range of the Paris Agreement. Have we all heard of the Paris Agreement? Yeah, lots of nodding. This is the intention to keep global temperatures within, well, below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times. So this is quite frightening. And the other point is that these are cascading tipping points as well. So the likelihood of one, when one has gone, the likelihood of the next one going as well is increased. Well, as we lose the albedo effect of ice at the polar caps, the reflective capability of that ice to actually reflect radiation back into space, and it becomes something that is not covered in ice and therefore accelerates in terms of temperature rise, we will start to see other Earth systems go as well. One of the things that stunned me was that the Amazon rainforest is now a net emitter of carbon. I've always thought of the Amazon rainforest as the lungs of the Earth, as this huge global carbon sink, which it has been, but because of land use change in various different forms, it's now a net emitter of global carbon. And there is a worrying amount of sea level rise in some of these ice sheets if they were to either slip off or melt entirely. This is the required emissions decline path. So where are we? We're about here. Emissions are not really falling at the moment. To reach net zero, we don't need to get to zero, we just need to get to the point where we're offsetting as much as we are emitting. But by 2030, to be on this path, we need to have halved global emissions. I'm told, because I didn't watch the show, but there is less time between now and 2030 than there is looking back between now and the last episode of Game of Thrones. So not long at all. It doesn't look like we're going to achieve this. And investors are starting to take note. So this was a study done by Cambridge Econometrics, which looked at a 60-40 portfolio. This is 60% equities, 40% bonds, a typical portfolio, and tried to simulate what would happen to the value of that portfolio against a baseline of no climate change whatsoever under these various scenarios. So even achieving net zero, there's an impairment, delayed and disorderly transition all the way through to a failed transition. These need to be taken with a pinch of salt. There are lots of studies out there and it's impossible to know exactly what this will mean, but it does show a general trend, which is something that we need to take note of. And who's taking the lead on this? Well, Mark Carney, of course, is now the Prime Minister of Canada, but when he was the Governor of the Bank of England, he gave a talk in 2015 to a room full of insurance executives. It became known as the Tragedy of the Horizon speech. And he spoke to them first because they have an explicit interest in trying to manage this risk. They act as the bedrock of the financial system, taking the first loss. And he warned that there would be, at some point in the future, if we didn't start to price these risks into our financial models, a climate Minsky moment, where the world would suddenly wake up to these risks and that we would have not necessarily a physical climate risk moment, although we are seeing those increasingly, but a transition risk moment where suddenly policy was put in place to deal with it. And lo and behold, 2 years ago, and since then we've seen more, major policy insurers have started to withdraw from some of the largest economies in the world. This is from California, which is certainly a top 5 economy. The equivalent of the direct line in the US pulled out of the state entirely. The state of California for homes was uninsurable, and not just in wildfire-affected areas, but in the whole state for various different reasons. So this is important for us as investors because if something's uninsurable, it's unbankable. You can't get a mortgage if that house isn't insurable. And we as investors need to take note because we need to be much more discerning about the expected return that we want from an investment when we're considering investing. Here's data from the European Environment Agency looking at the potential change in land values across Europe under I think this was from a 3-degree change by 2100, but I can get the data if anyone wants it. And we can see really significant changes in southern Europe. changes in southeastern UK as well, and actually increases in land values across parts of Northern Europe and parts of the UK. But this is something that investors are starting to take much more note from, and this is just in relation to climate. Oh, sorry. Sovereign bond yields, sovereign bond ratings, sorry, I should say, are also potentially impacted. This was work done by the Bennett Institute in Cambridge, which tried to put an impact on the cost of borrowing for governments under various different climate scenarios. And it doesn't look very pretty. We're seeing quite significant potential notch changes, i.e. downgrades to government debt profiles under various different climate scenarios. This, admittedly, is the worst potential climate scenario, but it still doesn't look very pretty if you look at the other scenarios too. This, again, is important because the risk-free rate government bond yields form the cornerstone of our discount rate and how we value assets. So we're taking note of this. Let's get to nature. Can anyone tell me what they think this chap's doing? There's usually somebody. Who said that? Yeah, go on. Pollinating? Pollinating, yeah, exactly. He is pollinating what I'm told is a pear tree. But I've seen this picture across various other forms of agriculture. I've seen 1,000-acre cotton fields where everyone is hand-pollinating all the plants because, of course, the insects that would naturally do this for free aren't there anymore because of modern agricultural techniques. So again, you know, this builds on, and Adam said this earlier about how we see climate change as being inflationary. It's impossible to tell how much, but this kind of thing, if we can't rely on nature, this is the fraying of that natural capital, that ecosystem service that insects used to provide, no longer there in parts of the world. And then we get to water. This really shocked me, actually. I only found this relatively recently. Of all of the water on the face of this planet, a lot is obviously seawater, 97%. Of the balance, at the moment, most is frozen. Of the 0.5 of fresh water that's available, most of it is in aquifers. The part that's actually available to us for all of the things that we generally use water for, whether that's in our sort of personal consumption or indeed for industry, is tiny. And that's partly because our water usage has grown so exponentially over the last 100 years or so, largely from agriculture, as we've had to feed so many more people, but also from industry and from cities as well. And lo and behold, 2 years ago, we had a state in not just China, but also in Europe, where rivers were so low that hydropower couldn't be generated, goods couldn't be shipped to market because the barges literally couldn't make their way down the rivers. So this kind of, again, fraying of natural capital has real economic impacts. You can see that dependency of the financial and manufactured capitals on nature. So there's a lot going on in this picture, and I'll try my best to explain it to you. But this starts to illustrate why there's an investment opportunity, not just in terms of regenerating and trying to create better systemic health, but actually in pure economic terms as well. All of these dots are countries in the world, and we're looking at them on this axis here in relation to the Human Development Index, which we could use, it's not a perfect analogy, but we could use as a proxy for poverty. As countries move closer to or further to the right and achieve more development, it's no surprise they move further up, because on this axis we have ecological footprint per capita. Note how there are very few countries in this blue box, and this is the Sustainable Development box. The UN SDGs is a term that I don't really hear anymore. You used to hear it all the time, 2020, 2021, since 2015 when they were first produced. I can't tell you the last time that I heard the SDGs mentioned, but let's just assume that there is some intention to try and achieve the UN SDGs, maybe not from parts of the world that we'd expect it from. And to achieve them, that has been costed. It's been costed by a team that includes Nicholas Stern, and that cost is put at $4 trillion a year. So there is an opportunity for business and for investors to help countries to reside in that blue box. At the moment, because we use we have such a high ecological footprint per capita. We use 1.6 planets worth of renewable and non-renewable resources each year. That is the very definition of unsustainable. Who's heard of Earth Overshoot Day? You've heard of that, yeah. Can you tell me when it is? I can't remember now. I think it's July sometime.
I think it's even earlier than that.
Probably earlier now, isn't it? Yeah. So,
Maybe.
yeah. Earth Overshoot Day is the day at which we have used one planet's worth of renewable resources, and then every day after that we are eating into future generations' ability. We are fraying that natural capital, and of course social capital as well. This is really interesting research done by the Global Footprint Network and the University of York. It's well worth looking up, and you can actually click on each individual dot and see where each country lies. You'll find out who that one is up there, for example. So $4 trillion, how much is that? I mean, it sounds like an impossibly large number, but actually, in the context of global GDP, it's less than 5%. It's probably about 5% now, because this is a little bit out of date. And in the context of defence spending, which of course is now very topical, it wasn't when I created this presentation, but it has become more topical, it is also, I think, manageable in the context of what the US was spending throughout the Cold War. These numbers are clearly picking up. The pressure on governments now to spend also on defence as well as invest in the SDGs or the energy transition, etc., is growing. But it's interesting that last week Germany announced as part of this debt break and spending package 100 billion euros for renewable power as well, because it is interlinked. Energy independence is something that goes hand in hand these days with security. I also want to dispel a myth, because it's often said that achieving net zero is impossibly expensive and it requires a World War II type effort and scale of spending. But it doesn't. I mean, that was 35% of GDP. So these numbers sound large, but in the context of the amount of wealth, the context of the amount of income, I should say, actually, because it's not capital GDP, of course, they should be manageable. Who noticed that I haven't used the term ESG yet at all? Purposefully avoided it. And that's because ESG, as we knew it, is dead. Lindsay Hooper, who works at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, wrote this really interesting piece in the FT, where she made the case for companies and indeed governments to go beyond just measurement and actually lobbying for radical change. And change that would, as she says, rather than asking how much sustainability can we afford, companies must ask how do we accelerate, navigate and benefit from the transition. The business case for sustainability is clear. Companies cannot thrive on a planet suffering from cascading crises. I think that's interesting. Another critic of ESG, this is a very academic thing, by the way, to critically analyse everything as we go. Don't worry, it'll be over in a second. Tariq Fancy, anyone know who he is, or more importantly, what his role was? Yeah, there was a hand. Yeah. He was. Do you know what he did there?
He was head of our sustainable practice. I say because I was at BlackRock.
You were at BlackRock. Did you know him?
Yes.
Excellent. Good. Well, I'll have to talk to you later. That would be very interesting. So yes, indeed, he was the chief investment officer for sustainability at BlackRock. He was at the very top of the organisation in the private jet with Larry Fink and the rest of the management team there. Indeed. Travelling the world, talking about various different things, including sustainable finance. And when he left, he wrote a very interesting, quite a long essay, which is well worth reading. I mean, I've kind of summarised it here for you. If nothing else, it's a very interesting insight, actually, at what happens at the top of large financial services organisations. But the point he wanted to make, and I think this is perhaps the critical part of this talk, is that the ESG community hurts rather than helps. It usefully collects data and reports standards, but does it actually achieve impact? Or worse, does it create the impression that impact is being achieved when perhaps it's not being achieved? Where actually can we achieve impact? So interesting. It's something that we'll hopefully come on to in the Q&A, about where impact is actually created, and whether we need to bust this myth that listed markets, for example, can actually create impact. So what are our conclusions? Well, I think very apt for this afternoon, the key question is, what is fiduciary duty in the 21st century? The traditional view has very much been about achieving risk-adjusted returns, acting in the best interests of another. But how holistic do we need to think about that? It's clear that economic prosperity is dependent on a range of different assets, not just financial and manufactured capital. And those economies that are likely to thrive in the future will be reinvesting and regenerating their natural capital, their social capital, investing in education, investing in an inclusive financial system as well. I told you that we were leaving with more questions and answers, and hopefully we'll arrive at some more conclusions in the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much, Max. You mentioned Donald Trump, said we might be talking about him in the questions. I came across a quote the other day that I feel could have come straight out of Donald Trump's mouth, and I think this is very relevant to today. It goes as follows. It goes, yes, and I'm not going to talk in an American accent, sorry, because I can't. Yes, we destroyed the planet, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. I think pretty much encapsulates the conundrum that we're facing right now, actually. Any questions? We've got one at the back. Thank you.
If ESG is dead, what's your view of how we should fix it?
So the answer to that question is complicated. In the first instance, and I purposely didn't today because I think everyone is sick to death of seeing the spectrum of capital picture. Have you seen that? This sort of idea that at one end you have traditional investment that doesn't regard climate risk as something that necessarily needs to be incorporated into the way that we invest, through to ESG integration, which does, sustainable investment, which then tries to integrate some form of double materiality, i.e. not just what impact is changes to natural capital going to have to us, or our bottom line, but actually what impact do we have on natural capital itself. And then of course you get to kind of full impact as well, where this concept of additionality comes in, and maybe we can come back to that when we talk a bit more about impact. So maybe I can talk a little bit about what we're doing at Rathbones just in the first instance to try and integrate climate risk. And again, Adam mentioned it, or he alluded to it very briefly when he was talking earlier on about our return projections, because as part of the Asset Allocation Committee, I'm involved in that process of taking climate risk and trying to understand what it means for macro variables. What impact does it have, or do we think it will have on inflation, on growth, and on various different sectors as well. So that's something that we've taken an academic approach to. We're also part of a group at Cambridge actually called the Investment Leaders Group, which works with other big asset managers and the academic department at CISL to produce research, and our latest research has been on integrating physical climate risk. So we've lent very heavily on the data, the academic evidence for damage functions and that kind of thing about how climate might impact those return projections going forward. So in the first instance, it's key, I think, for any investor to start to think holistically about that five capitals model. That it's, to my mind, even the most red-blooded hedge fund manager who said, I just care about making money, implicitly cares about the system in which he makes that money. And if it didn't exist or it imploded, then he couldn't, or she couldn't do that. So that's the first step. We then need to be very, very discerning about how we think about our impact as investors on the world as well. And this is where we have to be conscious of what's called the capital chain. And what that means really is what happens to the money that we deploy when we go into the market and buy some shares on behalf of a client, or we buy some bonds. Does that money actually make its way to the underlying entity, which may be doing good or bad in the world? Or does it actually just bounce off the system because it's about us trading shares in a secondary market, which is most of the activity that we and other asset managers do. If it's the latter, then our scope for impact is limited to our stewardship and engagement, which is non-negligible at all. It's we have a very good stewardship team who are able to do good things. But what I would say is that if you look at any of the evidence about real systemic change in relation to climate, the engagement with the fossil fuel industry has had sporadic impacts here and there, but ultimately they seem to have gone back to a mode of trying to create financial return from oil and gas rather than reinvesting in that positive impact.
Did you want to say something about the role of governments? Because if shareholders aren't going to be able to affect change, then perhaps in the end all of this really rests with governments and with regulatory reform, etc.
Yeah, of course. And sadly in the States we're seeing that roll back. So the government... This is the point that Tariq Fancy makes, and it's why, for those that are interested, I'd urge you to read the essay, because his point is that lots of what's going on in the corporate world is ultimately going to be window dressing, that it's only governments. The corporate world are the players in the game, and he talks about a basketball court, I should say. But they don't set the rules of the game, and the rules of the game have to be set in a way that is regenerative to our social and natural capital, our social systems and our natural systems as well. What I would also say is that there's a growing body of academic work that actually looks at how we can learn from nature and what there is to actually discern from nature to actually apply to our economic systems that might actually make them more sustainable for the future as well.
Sorry, can I just follow up? But do you think the standards themselves are too onerous? So putting fund managers through the type of hoops they're required to do in order to meet the say European standards, which I'm totally in favour of in principle, but I see the massive problems in actually translating that to reality.
There has been a major focus on metrics and targets, yeah, you're right. And there's been a lot of politics around labelling regimes as well. We saw that in the UK. I'm not going to opine on where those labels got to, but there is a danger that by creating these metrics, that is all that people will try to achieve, rather than actually thinking much more holistically about this problem. So it's difficult. Yeah, I would agree.
Question from Dale. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree 100% with what you just said in terms of it has to be governments that make this policy going forward, because the numbers are, yes, $4 trillion, relatively speaking to the whole GDP of the global economy, is not that big. But for corporates to do that is unthinkable. It's just such a big number. Yeah. And when you've got the largest economy in the world effectively walking back on some of the climate initiatives, it is a worrying time. But as a red-blooded hedge fund manager, what I will say is I'm thinking about what you have in your hand, which is the clean drinking water. Are there any obvious plays in that space?
I don't have a good answer to that at the moment. What I would say is that, clearly, if you look at the UK water utility space, it's something that's been underinvested in, and we can go into the detail maybe later. But it's something. It's interesting when you boil down a lot of the environmental issues, that concept of natural capital. A lot of it comes back to water scarcity. Extreme heat equals drought equals people whose livelihoods depend on agriculture not being able to do that, and they're therefore on the move. And one of the things we need to remember, of course, that involuntary migration is heavily linked to all of this. And as a species, we are nomadic, so we should be used to migration, but our political systems clearly aren't set up to deal with it, and we're seeing that, or we've seen that over the last 10, 15 years or so. I don't have a great answer to your question. It's something that the industry is looking at, but hopefully we can find the ways to tackle that issue.
Yes, we've got one from Ruth.
Thank you. Maybe I'll be a bit controversial. So you talked about government, you talked about the role of corporates. Should we have a role as a charity sector? So should we, as a sector, be doing something quite revolutionary, like seeking to redefine what growth and wealth looks like? because it feels a little bit from your talk like we're fiddling like while Rome burns. But I was particularly thinking about the water point, that, you know, even with carbon targets, it's still not going to sort out the problem with the water. So should we as a sector be calling for a different definition that's has much more of a focus on sustainability in its absolute form, and you know, it's a massive, you know, paradigm shift, but should we as a sector be doing something like that?
The answer to that is yes. I think this is absolutely the most critical question post what we've seen at USAID. You could argue that USAID was the biggest impact investor in the world, and it wasn't necessarily looking for financial returns, but the US and generally society benefited from that capital being spent. The US government benefited from soft power, etc. Now that vacuum may be filled by another big government, possibly China, that starts to do that sort of thing. But what's already happening is that a lot of the philanthropic work that the Gates Foundation, for example, was doing is now trying to step in to fill that vacuum, which means that what they were doing perhaps is going to be diluted. So I think this is, you know, I can't give you specific instances, but I would go as far as saying that yes, you're absolutely right. This is a time when charities need, quite understandably, to step up even further than they already are, which is difficult because we are in a time where security is scarce and protectionism is high, and therefore the money that was being spent. I mean, this is the same in the UK. We'll be cutting our aid budget to fund our security spending. So, great question.
So.
Thank you. It just seems to me there's a little bit of an elephant in the room of a question posed here, which is that these are all super complicated considerations, but what impact do they have on your asset selection committee when it comes to managing our investments?
So, as most systems do, as most humans do, you know, a lot of this is being dealt with. I showed you before that picture of the complex system. Do you remember that kind of circle with all these interdependent risks that escalate and de-escalate each other? And I wish I could say that our industry or that Rathbones was able to think in that kind of 10-dimensional chess to be able to incorporate a way that actually is able to understand about exactly how this will play out. But in typical fashion, you know, we're thinking about this as best we can in terms of a system. It's one of the reasons why I went back to university to go and learn about systems thinking, and we've got other people who certainly think like that too. But in the first instance, we're really thinking about climate and systemic risks, those risks that really aren't going away and will have an impact across all asset classes to varying degrees. So I said before that we're working very closely with Cambridge on actually understanding how to integrate that. This is the first year. It's not the first year we've integrated climate into our capital market assumptions, but it's the first year that we've actually used the Network for Greening Financial Systems data and other academic data as well to start to try and quantify the impact on inflation and on growth. And if you think about that, that probably sounds kind of, you know, small scale, but the portfolio construction process is understand those macro variables to try and project return expectations, which we then optimize to create a strategic asset allocation across asset classes. We then tactically asset allocate, and then we fill those buckets with equities and bonds, etc. So, and it's not just happening at that formative stage. When we actually look at companies themselves and we're thinking about investing in a specific company, they're not just climate, but impact, nature dependency, for example, will form part of that, and other factors too. This is slightly where the ESG scoring comes in, because we still rely to some degree on those ratings agencies for that data.
I've got a question. We've got 5 minutes, so may as well use it since we've all made the effort to come here. You talked a little bit about sort of listed equities and listed markets being a difficult place to try and create impact.
Yeah.
But to the extent that, you know, many charities, the majority of their portfolios, often the vast majority of their portfolios, will be invested in listed markets. And I guess my question is this. I guess as investors in listed equities, you've got two choices potentially for creating impact. You can either divest or invest, or you can think about sort of trying to use stewardship techniques. Any sort of thoughts about whether any of those really create any impact, or are they just pure window dressing?
I don't think they're pure window dressing, but I think the evidence is scarce that they're really tackling the big systemic risks. And so I think every investor has to ask themselves the question, or be asked by their investment manager. Actually, three questions. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to integrate ESG risk because you see it as a financial risk and you just want that to be managed alongside every other financial risk? For most investors, well, for every investor, that should be a yes, particularly for these systemic risks. The second question is, are there particular values that you need to project? Are there things that we need to do in the portfolio maybe to exclude sectors that you don't want to be associated with? And there will be many charities, of course, that will want to do that for various different reasons in relation to, you know, the causes that they're supporting, in relation to their reputation, etc. And the final question is, do you want to have impact? Because that is a whole different game. You know, the first two can be managed through listed equities and bonds. And we should remember that of the investable universe, the vast, vast majority of what we can invest in is listed. Private capital is actually a relatively small part, particularly private equity. But that really is where the impact is. And the purists would say that in terms of this so-called additionality. So additionality is about asking the question, or the counterfactual question, I guess, is, you know, what would have happened had I not invested? Would the world have changed or not? So additionality is about proving that you as the investor have had some kind of positive impact, which is possible through stewardship, but difficult. Voting, as we know, can be powerful, but, you know, with lots of companies in the States now, they have super voting class shares, so, you know, it doesn't really matter how people vote if they get a vote at all. So the purists would say that actually it's catalytic capital, it's venture where there is, you know, the most impact. But it's not just defined or just found in that area. There are other areas too. But I think we need to be very careful about creating the impression that we have impact in listed markets, when actually those efforts could be directed to things that have bigger outcomes in the real world.